Blackstone Audio presents
Occult America, The Secret History of How Mysticism Shaped Our Nation, by Mitch Horowitz. To Allison, who makes everything possible. O Egypt, Egypt, there will remain of thy religion only fables. Hermetica. Introduction. What is the occult? And what is it doing in America? Religious history, like literary or any cultural history, is made by genius, by the mystery of rare human personalities. Harold Bloom, The American Religion. In the summer of 1693, the philosopher Johannes Kelpius and a small band of followers fled their Rhine Valley homeland. The region had once been a sanctuary of political independence and esoteric spirituality. It was now a charred land of devastation, crushed by the papal Habsburg Empire during the 30 Years' War. The 21-year-old Kelpius, a protege of mystical scholars who survived in the Rhine corridor, led his German pilgrims to the New World. Fewer than 40 in number, they first traveled over land and later endured a 5-month sea voyage, which proved less dangerous for the weather than for warring French and British ships crisscrossing Atlantic routes. By late June of 1694, the group reached Philadelphia, then a cluster of about 500 houses. They settled along the wooded banks of the Wissahickon Creek outside town. There they lived a monastic existence, occupying caves and constructing a 40-foot square log tabernacle topped with a telescope, from which they scanned the stars for holy signs. By sunlight and hearth fire, they studied astrology, alchemy, number symbolism, esoteric Christianity, Kabbalah, and other philosophies that had once flowered back home. Newcomers journeyed to America to join their tabernacle in the forest, and in the years following Kelpius's death from tuberculosis in 1708, they created a larger commune at Ephrata, Pennsylvania. News drifted back to the Old World. A land existed where mystical thinkers and mystery religions, remnants of esoteric movements that had thrived during the Renaissance and were later harassed, could find safe harbor. And so began a revolution in religious life that was eventually felt around the earth. America hosted a remarkable assortment of breakaway faiths, from Mormonism to Seventh-day Adventism to Christian Science. But one movement that grew within its borders came to wield radical influence over 19th and 20th century spirituality. It encompassed a wide array of mystical philosophies and mythical lore, particularly the belief in an unseen world whose forces act upon us and through us. It is called the occult. The teachers and purveyors of the American occult, colorful, audacious, and often deeply self-educated men and women, shattered every stereotype, real and imagined, of the power-mad dabbler in dark arts. Rather than seeing mystical or magical ideas as a means to narcissistic power or moral freedom, they emphasized an unlikely ethic of social progress and individual betterment. These religious radicals, acting outside the folds of traditional churches and mostly overlooked or ignored in the pages of history, transformed a young nation into the launching pad for the revolutions in therapeutic and alternative spirituality that swept the earth in the 19th and 20th centuries, even reigniting mystical traditions in the East. Sons of Frankenstein. In her 1818 novel, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley offered a stirring portrait, not sympathetic, but not as unsympathetic as many suppose, of the European occult in the Age of Enlightenment in the 1700s. Her budding scientist Victor Frankenstein was torn between the occult visions that drew him to science as a child and the materialist philosophy of his peers. It was very different when the masters of science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. In the public mind, the occultist craved immortality, deific power, and limitless knowledge. It was an image that popular occultists often fed. The 19th century French magician Eliphas Lévy fancied the occult arts, a science which confers on man powers apparently superhuman. England's great beast, Aleister Crowley, extolled self-gratification in his best-known maxim, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." The standard-bearers of the American occult took a different path. They sought to remake mystical ideas as tools of public good and self-help. The most influential trance medium of the 19th century, Andrew Jackson Davis, called the Poughkeepsie Seer after his Hudson Valley, New York home, enthralled thousands with visions of heaven as a place that included all the world's people, black, white, Indian, and followers of every religion. In early America, the occult and liberalism were closely joined, especially in the movement of spiritualism, or contacting the dead, whose newspapers and practitioners were ardently abolitionist and suffragist. For women, spiritualist practices from seances to spirit channeling became vehicles for the earliest forms of religious and political leadership. The first American-born woman to become a recognized public preacher was Jemima Wilkinson. In 1776, at age 24, she claimed to have died and returned to life as a medium of the divine spirit, calling herself the public universal friend. The friend, like the Rhine Valley mystics and Andrew Jackson Davis, remained a Christian. While her claims of supernatural rebirth and spirit channeling fell squarely within the occult framework, her religious perspective was unmistakably scriptural. For a time, this was the nature of most American occultists, and it would never fully disappear. Few of them expressed any feelings of contradiction between Christian devotion and arcane methods of practice. Eventually, the occult and its acolytes came to branch ever more clearly into a separate and distinct spiritual culture, though not necessarily shedding a Christian moral outlook. In the years between the Civil War and World War II, Americans took a do-it-yourself approach to many aspects of life, including the occult. Their enthusiasms resulted in strange inventions like the Ouija board, a boom in pop astrology, and a revolution in metaphysical mail-order courses and how-to guides. Breaking with the habits of the old world, American occultists often proved wary of secret lodges and brotherhoods. They wanted to evangelize occult teachings as tools that ordinary men and women could use to contend with the problems of daily life. In their hands, methods that had once seemed forbidden or even sinister in the old world, such as mesmerism, soothsaying, and necromancy, morphed into a bevy of friendlier-sounding philosophies, some involving mind-body healing, positive visualization, and talking to angelic spirits. The early 20th century progressive minister, Wallace D. Wattles, whose writing later inspired the book and movie The Secret, conceived of a physical science of getting rich, which he saw more as a program of wealth redistribution than a means of personal enrichment. Similarly, the black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey attempted to harness the mind power, or positive thinking principles so popular within American mysticism, as a path to black liberation. Even at the highest rung of American politics, the Iowan farmer-seeker Henry A. Wallace, who served as Franklin Roosevelt's second vice president, drew ethical ideas from his lifelong passion for the occult and envisioned the dawn of a spiritually enlightened New Deal of the ages. Since the mid-19th century, denizens of the American occult had foretold a new age in education, cooperation, and inner awakening. in the depth and reach of their careers, in their marriage of arcane methods with self-improvement philosophy, and in their determination to bring mysticism to the masses, they remade occultism into the harbinger of a new era in self-empowering and healing spirituality. Its arcane roots, however, became overgrown and forgotten. The Silver Moon. Mysteries can be found wherever you look, especially when you're not sure what you're looking for. My brush with the occult began on a quiet Sunday morning in the mid-1970s at a diner in the Queens neighborhood where I grew up, a place of bungalow-size houses and cracked sidewalks that straddles the invisible boundary between the farthest reaches of New York City and the suburbs of Long Island. As a restless 9-year-old, I fidgeted at a table crowded with parents, aunts, and older cousins. Bored with the grown-up conversation, I wandered toward the front of the restaurant, the place where the real wonders were: cigarette machines, rows of exotic-looking liquor bottles above the cashier counter, brochure racks with dating service questionnaires, a boxy machine that could print out your biorhythm. It was a carnival of the slightly forbidden. One vending machine especially caught my eye: a dime horoscope dispenser. Drop in a coin, pull a lever, and out would slide a little pink scroll wound in a clear plastic sleeve. Unroll it, and there appeared a brief analysis for each day of the month. I was a ripe customer. I had just borrowed a book of American folklore from our local library. It contained an eerie pentagram-like chart over which, eyes closed, you could hover a pin and bring it down on a prophecy: a new love, loss, good health, and so on. My prophecy read, a letter. At 9, letters rarely found me, but the very next day, one arrived, from the library. My hands shook when I opened it, only to remove a carbon-copied overdue slip. But still. In the 1970s, the supernatural was in the air. I overheard my big sister on the phone discussing whether ex-Beatle Ringo Starr had shaved his head in solidarity with the youth culture's Prince of Darkness, Charles Manson. Books on ESP, Bigfoot, and True Hauntings appeared in the Arrow Book Club catalogs at my elementary school. Friends huddled in basements for seances and Ouija sessions. The Exorcist was the movie that no one on the block was allowed to see. On TV, Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas chatted with clairvoyants, astrologers, and robed gurus. Everything seemed to hint at a strange other world not so far away from our own. Or so it seemed that Sunday morning, as I bounded back to the table to show off my star scroll. "Look what it says," I announced, reading out predictions that were always just reasonable enough to come true. "Does it also say you're a sucker?" asked my grandfather, the perpetually exhausted manager of a flower shop. His lack of even the slightest curiosity about the mysteries of the world was as impossible for me to understand as my boyish enthusiasm was for him. While I didn't yet know the lines from Hamlet, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy," I felt their meaning in my guts. Peering down at my star scroll, I wondered, where did this stuff come from? The zodiac signs, their symbols, the meanings, all this came from somewhere old. But where? And how did it reach Queens? Although I wouldn't know it until many years later, my dime scroll philosophy contained a surprising likeness to the ideas of Claudius Ptolemy, the Greco-Egyptian astrologer-astronomer of the 2nd century A.D., who had codified the basic principles of heavenly lore in his Tetrabiblos. In Ptolemy's pages stood concepts that had already stretched across millennia and followed a jagged path, sometimes broken by adaptations and bastardizations. They ranged from the philosophy of primeval Babylon to classical Egypt to Ptolemy's late Hellenic era, to the Renaissance courts of Europe, to popularizations of the 19th and 20th centuries, and, finally, to the star scroll bought by a 9-year-old one morning in a local diner, a place aptly named the Silver Moon. In Ptolemy's day, astrology remained a mainstay of royal courts and academies, but by the 4th century A.D., it would fall into disfavor under the influence of early church fathers, who warned that divinatory practices were an easy portal for demonic powers. In the Church's zeal to erase the old practices that had endured throughout the late ancient world, even Rome's first Christian emperor, Constantine, personally combined Christianity with sun worship. Bishops branded pantheists and nature worshippers, astrologers and cosmologists, cultists and soothsayers in ways that such believers had never conceived of themselves, as practitioners of Satanism and black magic. It was a new classification of villainy, entirely of the Church's invention. Once so characterized, the religious minority could be outlawed and persecuted, just as early Christians had been by pagan powers. The fall of Rome meant the almost total collapse of esoteric and pre-Christian belief systems in Europe, as ancient books and ideas were scattered to the chaos of the Dark Ages. Only fortress-like monasteries, where old libraries could be hidden, protected the mystery traditions from complete destruction. By the time Greco-Egyptian texts and philosophy started to re-emerge in the medieval and Renaissance ages, astrology and other divinatory methods began to be referred to under the name occultism. Occultism describes a tradition, religious, literary, and intellectual, that has existed throughout Western history. The term comes from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden or secret. The word occult entered modern use through the work of Renaissance scholar Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who used it to describe magical practices and veiled spiritual philosophies in his 3-volume study De Occulta Philosophia in 1533. The Oxford English Dictionary cites the first instance of the word occult 12 years later. Traditionally, occultism deals with the inner aspect of religions, the mystical doorways of realization and secret ways of knowing. Classical occultism regards itself as an initiatory spiritual tradition. Seen from that perspective, the occultist is not necessarily born with unusual abilities, like soothsaying or mind-reading, but trains for them. Such parameters, however, are loose. Spiritualism is impossible to separate from occultism. Whether believers consider channeling the dead a learned skill or a passive gift, its crypto-religious nature draws it into the occult framework. Indeed, occultism, at its heart, is religious. Renaissance occultists were particularly enamored of Jewish Kabbalah, Christian Gnosticism, Egypto-Hellenic astrology, Egyptian-Arab alchemy, and prophetic or divinatory rituals found deep within all the historic faiths, especially within the mystery religions of the Hellenic and Egyptian civilizations. They venerated the ideas of the Hermetica, a collection of late ancient writings attributed to the mythical Greco-Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. The name Hermes Trismegistus meant thrice greatest Hermes, a Greek term of veneration for Thoth, Egypt's god of writing, whom the Greeks conflated with their own Hermes, and later with the Roman Mercury. The Hermetica reflected the final stages of the magico-religious thought of Alexandria, and formed a critical link between ancient Egypt and the modern occult. The sturdiest definition of classical occult philosophy that I have personally found appears not in a Western or Egyptian context, but in Sino-scholar Richard Wilhelm's 1950 introduction to the Chinese oracle book the I Ching, or Book of Changes. Every event in the visible world is the effect of an image, that is, of an idea in the unseen world. Accordingly, everything that happens on earth is only a reproduction, as it were, of an event in a world beyond our sense perception. As regards its occurrence in time, it is later than the suprasensible event. The holy men and sages who are in contact with those higher spheres have access to these ideas through direct intuition and are therefore able to intervene decisively in events in the world. Thus man is linked with heaven, the suprasensible world of ideas, and with earth, the material world of visible things, to form with these a trinity of primal powers. Of dime horoscopes. Back for a moment to the Silver Moon Diner. What of the coin machine where I bought my horoscope that morning? It had its own story, one perhaps less august than that of ancient scholars or Renaissance courts, but, to a young boy, no less fascinating. It was invented in 1934 by a clothing and security salesman named Bruce King, or as he was better known by his nom de mystique, Zolar. It comes from the zodiac and solar system, he explained. Registered U.S. trademark. His initiation was not in the temples of Egypt, but on the boardwalks of Atlantic City, New Jersey. There he witnessed a goateed professor, A.F. Seward, thrusting a pointer at a huge zodiac chart while lecturing beachgoers on the destiny of the stars. Professor Seward sold $1 horoscopes to countless vacationers, so many, rumor went, that he retired to Florida a millionaire. The rumor, as will be seen, was true. Bursting forth from the boardwalks, Bruce King knew he had what it took to sell mysticism to the masses. I felt the competition wasn't great, he told John Updike in the New Yorker in 1959, and I could become the biggest man in the field. Zolar immersed himself in astrology, tarot, palmistry, and all the magical arts on which he could expound with surprising erudition. Everything I've ever known I've taught myself, he said. I've studied psychiatry, sociology, and every field of human relations as well as the occult. For all his "have I got a deal for you" pitch, Zolar knew his material. His biggest breakout came in 1935, when the dime store empire Woolworths agreed to sell his pocket-sized daily horoscopes, the first generation of the mass-marketed horoscope booklets that now adorn the racks at supermarket checkout lines. The secret to Zolar's success was that he spoke in a language everyone could understand. I'm like the old $2 country doctor, a general practitioner, he once said. If you want a specialist, you go somewhere else. Zolar could even sound like my grandfather when giving a reporter the lowdown on the resurgence of astrology in 1970. It sounds kind of crazy, but you know that screwy play Hair that has the Aquarian thing? Zolar was speaking, of course, of the rock musical's rousing opener, Aquarius. I think that sold 5 million horoscopes. So it had, and in America, the old mysteries were on the move. Chapter 1. The Psychic Highway. Yet who knows but the institution of a new order of laborers in the great spiritual vineyard is to prove the signal for the outpouring of such blessings as have been hitherto unparalleled in the history of our American Israel. Western Recorder, 1825. The Age of Reason could seem anything but reasonable for people with unusual religious beliefs, or those accused of them. In 1782, Switzerland sanctioned one of the Western world's last witch trials, which ended in the torture and beheading of a rural housemaid. In 1791, the Vatican sentenced the legendary Italian occultist, called Cagliostro, to death on charges of heresy and Freemasonry. Although his execution was stayed, the self-styled high priest of the Egyptian mysteries died of disease 4 years later, in the dungeons of the Inquisition. In 18th century England, a young woman with the simple name of Anne Lee, living in the industrial town of Manchester on Toad Lane, where she was born in a leap year, told of magical visions and spoke of prophecies. The girl, who belonged to a radical Christian sect that would become known as the Shaking Quakers, or the Shakers, was hounded, beaten, and jailed on charges of sorcery and public disruption. Local authorities were aghast at the otherworldly possession that seemed to grip her and the other Shakers when they gyrated and shook in spirit trances. But she was not destined to become another casualty. Anne Lee escaped. In 1774, the woman now called Mother Ann sailed from Liverpool to New York with 8 followers and hangers-on. They included an unfaithful husband with whom she had already suffered through the birth and death of 4 infants. As the legend goes, the ship almost capsized in a storm, but Anne, in a state of eerie calm as waves crashed over the bow, told the captain that no harm would befall them. She reported seeing 2 bright angels of God on the mast. The ship survived. After toiling at menial labor in New York City, the Pilgrims, now 12 minus Anne's husband, scraped together enough resources in 1776 to form a tiny colony in the knotty, marshy fields of Niskayuna, near Albany in New York's Hudson Valley. The 12 apostles, as they saw themselves, anointed the place Wisdom's Valley. It was a punishing, swampy stretch of 200 acres, swept barren by icy winds in the winter and transformed into muddy, mosquito-infested fields in the summer. Their neighbors were no friendlier than the landscape. Angry rumors painted Mother Ann and the Shakers, all sworn pacifists, as British sympathizers or spies. Revolutionary authorities briefly jailed the religious leader in Albany on charges of sedition. During a Shaker missionary trip to Petersham, Massachusetts, a band of 30 townsmen seized Mother Ann and subjected the celibate woman to the humiliation of disrobing, ostensibly to determine whether she was an English agent in drag. Some accused her of witchcraft or heresy. "There is no witchcraft but sin," Mother Ann evenly countered. But oddly, the little sect, celibate, poor, steeped in a life of hard labor and little rest, began to grow. Following a brutal upstate New York winter in 1780, 2 men from across the Hudson River in the farming community of New Lebanon took advantage of an early spring thaw to visit the Shaker settlement. The men were disappointed followers of one of the many Baptist revivals that had been sweeping the region, and they longed to see the woman whom followers called Christ returned in female form. When they located Mother Ann and her colony in the wilderness, they were astonished at the small group's survival. They began asking Mother Ann about her mystical teachings and rumors of the sect's practices, in which members spoke in prophecies, saw visions of the dead, and danced, jumped, and shouted in the thrall of the Holy Spirit. "We are the people who turned the world upside down," Mother Ann enigmatically told them. The men returned to New Lebanon to spread word of the people in the woods, and more curiosity-seekers trekked to Niskayuna. Strange natural events drove newcomers into Mother Ann's little world. On May 19, 1780, many parts of New England experienced the Dark Day, a period when the daytime skies mysteriously blackened and the sun's rays were blotted out. The cause may have been a rash of local fires to clear fields, but the effect was panic over the coming of Armageddon. Mother Ann's warnings about the debased nature of the world suddenly seemed prophetic, and new converts came to her. To the Shakers, it was all expected. The previous year, Mother Ann had told her followers to store up extra provisions. "We shall have company enough before another year comes about to consume it all." Soon, New Lebanon itself sprouted a much bigger colony, eventually sporting the immaculate whitewashed buildings, tidy yards, and brick meeting houses for which the Shakers became famous. Though Mother Ann died in 1784, her influence extended further in death than in life. The late 1830s saw the dawn of a feverish and profoundly influential period of Shaker activity, called Mother Ann's Work. The departed leader appeared as an otherworldly spirit guide, directing a vast range of supernatural activity and instruction. Shaker villages, now spread as far south as Kentucky, recorded visits from spirits of historical figures and vanquished Indian tribes. The devout reported receiving ghostly visions and songs, which they turned into strangely beautiful paintings and haunting hymns, many of which still survive. Villagers spoke in foreign tongues, writhing and rolling on the floors in meetings that lasted all night, some even getting drunk on spirit gifts of unseen wine or Indian tobacco. In an America that had not yet experienced the spiritualist wave of seances, table tilting, or conversing with the dead, the Shakers foretold that beings from the afterlife would soon visit every city and hamlet, every palace and cottage in the land. And events unfolding outside the manicured grounds of Shaker villages were already bringing that prophecy to life. The Burned-Over District. The Shakers had laid down their roots in an area that would prove pivotal in American culture, its influence vastly surpassing its size. The region's role is as central to the development of mystical religions in America as the sands of the Sinai are to Judaism, and no account of American religion is possible without taking stock of it. The 20th century historian Carl Carmer called this area a broad psychic highway, a thoroughfare of the occult. A snaking stretch of land in central New York State, it was a place of pristine lakes and rolling green hills, about 25 miles wide and 300 miles long, extending from Albany in the east to Buffalo in the west. It became one of the main passages through which Americans flowed west. It remains so today as U.S. Route 20, an east-west highway that begins in New England, gently traversing the bends and slopes of central New York's farmland before heading across the expanse of the nation to the Pacific Northwest. It is the longest continuous road in the United States. As fate and geography would have it, this great corridor cuts directly across a part of central New York that in the 19th century became so caught up in the fires of religious revival movements, the fires of the spirit, that it became known as the Burned-Over District. Before the Revolutionary War, the Burned-Over District was home to the Iroquois nation, whose remnants the new American government pushed out, partly in retaliation for the tribe's alliance with the British, and partly to satisfy the land hunger of early settlers and speculators. And when settlers did arrive after the war, most of them unaware of the Indian lives that had been extinguished or hounded from the rich soil, the place seemed like an Eden of bountiful open land and vast lakes. Throughout the first decades of the 19th century, itinerant ministers continually traveled the newly settled region, crisscrossing its hills and valleys with news of the Holy Spirit. The circuit-riding preachers and their tent revival meetings often left the area in a torrent of religious passion. For days afterwards, without the prompting of ministers or revivalists, men and women would speak in tongues and writhe in religious ecstasy. Many would report visitations from angels or spirits. Folklore told of the area once being home to a mysterious tribe, older than the oldest of Indian tribes, maybe even a lost tribe of Israel. These ancient beings, so the story went, had been wiped out in a confrontation with the Native Americans. Some believed their ghosts and messengers still walked, composing a world within a world, amid the daily goings-on of burned-over district life. The Burned-Over District's early religious communities thrived on a steady pool of migrants drawn to the region's abundant land. This new breed of Yankee, streaming westward from New England, was spiritually curious, ready to listen and believe. In the starlit nights of pioneer life, many minds and hearts turned to the whispers of the cosmos and the mysteries of what might be. Apocalypse Postponed. If the burned-over district became a staging ground for a young nation's foray into unconventional and alternative religious ideas, it was in the mood and mindset of its residents that the journey took flight. The mental habits of the burned-over district can best be understood by looking at one of the great schisms of American religious history. It concerns an early 19th century sect called the Millerites, later known as the Seventh-day Adventists. This group of believers, which numbered in the thousands by the 1840s, followed the utopian millenarian ideas of a Freemason and Baptist clergyman named William Miller. Born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Miller grew up estranged from his strict Baptist upbringing, more or less indifferent to religion. But after fighting in the War of 1812, he took up a common view among returning soldiers that his survival had somehow been divinely ordained. The former secularist came home with a deep interest in questions of immortality. Convinced that the Bible was a record of literal truths, Miller undertook a comprehensive study to determine the time of Christ's return, and the millennium of peace he believed it would bring. Though only moderately educated, Miller spent 14 years poring over Scripture, organizing and cross-referencing all that he found, and endeavoring, in true Yankee fashion, to find an orderly blueprint to God's plan. Miller's data pointed to the end as falling somewhere between March 21, 1843, and March 21, 1844. He later recast the final call to October 22, 1844. By the early 1830s, he had begun to gain a serious audience, first as one of the burned-over district's legion of itinerant religious speakers, and later as a Baptist minister. As Miller's portentous dates neared, hundreds and then thousands of followers gathered at tent revival meetings throughout central New York. They filled, and sometimes overflowed, the biggest tent the nation had ever seen, one that could seat 3,000 people. Once, near Rochester, a wind squall snapped 15 of its chains and several inch-thick ropes, violently ripping the tent from its moorings like the opening of a gigantic clamshell. Amazingly, no one was hurt, which deepened local belief that Miller's movement was charmed. When an economic depression swept the burned-over district in the late 1830s and early 1840s, it served only to heighten the yearning for deliverance and the feeling that familiar institutions were slipping away. A widely promulgated myth tells that as 1843 approached, the man the press called Mad Miller and his followers shed their last possessions, donned white ascension robes, and waited on hilltops for the new advent. Stories abound in popular histories and local tales that some ran amok, engaging in free love and throwing money to the wind in anticipation of a world without wants or demands. Not only is this portrait historically inaccurate, without any viable source material in newspapers of the day, but it misunderstands the unusual blend of magical beliefs and practical habits that marked so many lives in the burned-over district. In fact, Miller's followers never sold their belongings en masse, retreated to hilltops, or, except for rare cases, threw responsibility to the winds as they awaited their savior. What few such episodes did occur were seized upon and exaggerated by those neighbors who mocked and, in some cases, even physically attacked the Millerites as they congregated in meeting halls and homes. Most evidence shows that these Yankee acolytes toiled right up to the point of Miller's end times, working at their jobs maintaining their farms, and attending school. Barns were swept, haylofts loaded, and fireplaces stoked before the arrival of the last days. While followers believed in and were passionate for progress and perfection, they never abandoned the worldly. And this was the distinct habit of thought in the burned-over district. The ability to believe so deeply in the other world that it could be felt as a palpable presence, but also to possess the soundness of mind and instinct to, in the Shaker formulation, keep hands to work even as hearts soared to God. It was a key facet of the occult and metaphysical mindset being born in America. The Universal Friend. The dreamers and planners who flourished along the psychic highway seemed to relish splitting apart orthodoxies, remaking Christianity as a new source of mystery and magic. One woman in particular, today long forgotten, created in the mind of her followers a dramatically new idea of what a divine messenger could be. A New Englander by birth, she became the first American-born woman to found a spiritual order. Unlike Anne Lee, she wasn't seen as a female return of Christ, but rather as a medium or channel possessed of the divine spirit. Her name was Jemima Wilkinson. Wilkinson was born in 1752 to a moderately prosperous farming household of Quakers in Cumberland, Rhode Island. She lost her mother at age 12 and grew up under the care of older sisters, riding horses, gardening, and reading the basics of Quaker theology. The girl grew into a young woman of personal beauty who took pleasure in adding to her good appearance the graceful drapery of elegant apparel. Historian Stafford C. Cleveland wrote in his 1873 History and Directory of Yates County, which became the earliest biographical narrative of any repute of Wilkinson. Later in Wilkinson's life, onlookers commented on her fresh complexion and gently tanned skin, the ringlets of chestnut-brown hair that draped her neck, and her flashing black eyes. The attractive young woman presented a strikingly different figure than Mother Anne Lee, that is, if testimony from the spirit world can be relied upon. Although no images survive of Mother Anne, some of her 19th-century followers doted on a psychometric portrait of their founder. The portrait was created by a New York artist who, when handed an object, claimed to clairvoyantly summon the vision of its owner. Whatever his abilities, the psychometrist was not attempting flattery. The supernatural image of Anne Lee revealed a dark, straight-haired woman with an unusually large forehead, dull eyes, and thick, masculine lips. To her followers, it accurately captured a degree of world-weariness in Anne Lee far different from anything that would have been known by Jemima Wilkinson, raised amid the relative comforts of a successful New England farm. By about 16, Wilkinson had been educated in the subjects expected of a girl from a modest estate: poetry, current news, and light literature. But in a short time she became wrapped up in a Rhode Island religious revival, and her life took a dramatically different turn. It was the last phase of the Great Awakening, brought to New England by a charismatic British preacher, George Whitefield, who, in 1770, was making his final tour of the area. Wilkinson fell in with a group of revivalist Baptists in Cumberland and began to comb through the Bible with strange intensity. She often meditated and sat alone in her room. Within a few years of her religious rebirth, Wilkinson showed signs of another wave sweeping the area: typhus fever. On October 4, 1776, Wilkinson stumbled to her bed with a high temperature. She slipped in and out of delirium, returning to consciousness to describe dreams of heavenly realms and their angelic inhabitants. Her health worsened, and she fell into a comatose state where her breathing grew faint and her pulse slowed. The end seemed imminent. But after 36 hours immobile in a near-lifeless state, she suddenly bounded from bed with a burst of renewed energy. Jemima Wilkinson had passed to the angel world, she told her family, and the girlish form before them was now reanimated by a spirit destined to deliver the oracles of God. This new entity told visitors and family that she would respond to no other name than Public Universal Friend. On the Sunday following her recovery, though still skinny and pale from her illness, the Public Universal Friend went to a local church that was a center of the area's Baptist revival. The congregation was taken aback at the reappearance of the young woman who had been written off as dead. After services, surprise turned to shock when Wilkinson walked out to a shady tree in the churchyard and began preaching. It was probably the first time any of them had seen a woman deliver a homily in public. Her message, repentance from sin, humility, the golden rule, was little more than warmed-over Quakerism. But it electrified listeners, who marveled at the confidence and eloquence of the formerly bedridden girl who now claimed to be a supernatural channel. The Friend soon began traveling around New England and down to Philadelphia, not exactly seeking converts to a religion, but followers of her as an avatar of God. While in Philadelphia, the Friend came under the influence of at least one close admirer with ties to the mystical commune at Ephrata, in Lancaster County. The commune had been founded in 1732 by Johann Conrad Bissell, a dynamic successor to the Rhine Valley mystic Kelpius. Like the Ephratans, the Friend came to reject the formality of church services, liturgy, confessions of faith, and vows. She adopted the Ephratan practice of identifying the Sabbath on Saturday. Also, like the German mystics from Lancaster, she encouraged, but stopped short of demanding, celibacy among her followers. If anything, the Friend's appeal was characterized by its almost total lack of hardened doctrine. She relied instead upon the lessons of Scripture and a simple do unto others ethic. Indeed, the Friend's teachings, in contrast to her fantastic claims about herself, could seem downright ordinary, extending to the virtues of punctuality and good neighborliness. Unlike the intense devotees around Mother Ann Lee, the Friend attracted a milder circle of landowners, merchants, and gentry. Shakerism, by contrast, was always running afoul of authorities as a migrant British movement whose converts came largely from the rear pews, kitchen maids, hired hands, and hard-scrabble farmers. Followers of Mother Ann were once jailed simply on a rumor that they were driving sheep into British-held territory. The Universal Friend, on the other hand, moved freely around Rhode Island during the Revolutionary War, preaching to both American and English troops. Even when the Friend did end up in court after the war, the results were almost comical. In a dispute with an angry ex-follower, the Friend was dragged before a central New York circuit court on charges of blasphemy, only to hear the presiding judge calmly inform the parties that blasphemy was not an indictable offense in the new republic. In a tale that would be dismissible as legend were it not on public record, Judge Morgan Lewis, later the governor of New York, then invited the Friend to preach before the court and applauded her good counsel. It was a reception Mother Ann never could have dreamed of. Pioneer Prophetess. After learning about the success of Ephrata, the Friend's followers began to discuss creating a colony of their own. By late 1788, a cluster of devotees journeyed from New England to the lakes of central New York to break ground on a settlement to house the Universal Friend. In so doing, followers of the pioneer prophetess, as Wilkinson's impeccable 20th century biographer, Herbert A. Wisby, Jr., dubbed her, became some of the earliest white settlers of central New York. Their community of Jerusalem eventually grew near Crooked Lake, now called Keuka Lake. It continues to stand as an incorporated town today, a place in which family names belonging to the Friends' earliest followers still appear in the local telephone directory. Many Central New Yorkers harbored conflicting attitudes toward their spirit-possessed pioneer, who cut a theatrical presence in her trademark cape and wide-brimmed hat. Their ambivalence resulted in a wide range of tall tales that depicted the Friend as a shrewd operator of slightly ill repute. One story of the Friend is as deeply ingrained in the folklore of New York State as is the legend of the Headless Horseman. Like many folk tales, its location changes with nearly every recitation, the setting variously put at the banks of Seneca or Keuka Lake, or on bodies of water stretching as far north as Rhode Island or as far south as Schuylkill River near Philadelphia. It gets repeated today on the tidy main street of the central New York town of Penn Yan, near Jerusalem, where one teller sincerely placed the story at a canal at the end of the road. Based on prevailing versions, it goes this way. One morning, the Friend led a band of followers to a lakeshore, where she preached to them on the powers of faith. She built to a fiery conclusion and then proclaimed she was going to walk on water.
"Have ye faith that I can do this thing?" she demanded of the crowd.
"Yea, we believe," followers replied. "Then if ye have faith," the universal Friend said, "there is no need for any vulgar spectacle." And with that she turned around, got into her carriage monogrammed with her initials, U*F, and rode off. The only confirmable part of the story is the monogrammed carriage, which still survives. Another apparent fiction surrounded the Friend's death. Her detractors claimed that the Friend said she was immortal, and that, when she died in 1819, her deputies snuck her body out of her Jerusalem basement by night and secreted it to an unmarked grave. In fact, Wilkinson's body was interred with several others in a traditional burial vault on her property. It was not until several years later that her remains were moved, in Quaker fashion, to an unmarked plot. Legal battles over township land emerged before and after the Friend's death, but by and large her followers and their families, similar in spirit to the Millerites, balanced within them both fantastical beliefs and the canny abilities and competences needed for a successful outer life. Following their teacher's death, these farmers, merchants, and tradesmen moved on to populate many of the region's liberal and experimental religious communities. The Friends' ministry, at once supernatural and down-to-earth, played a lasting, if little-seen role in peopling the movements and attitudes that traveled the psychic highway, and acculturated the nation to religious experiments. The Lost Tribe. When Route 20 remained just a well-traveled carriage path, an ambitious, dreamy young man who grew up near its perimeter in the town of Palmyra, about 40 miles north of the Universal Friends settlement, became its most influential traveler. Raised on the folklore of the burned-over district and possessed of ingenious and extraordinary visions, he went on to establish one of the fastest-growing religions of the contemporary world: Mormonism. As a teenage boy in the late 1810s and early 1820s, Joseph Smith of Palmyra was locally known as a clairvoyant guide who could track down hidden treasure using a seer stone, a smooth rock, variously opaque or marked with magic symbols, that he placed in his hat and gazed into to gain the power of second sight. The manner in which Smith went about peep-stoning might be compared today with scrying or crystal gazing. The area's buried treasure hunters valued his talents. In the early 19th century, many Western and Central New Yorkers believed that ancient artifacts were squirreled away within Indian burial mounds or subterranean chambers under the region's hills and valleys. Legend told of buried ruins that belonged to a civilization older than the Indians. Magic and myth were part of the firmament of the Smith household. According to historian D. Michael Quinn in his monumental study, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, Joseph Smith's family owned magical charms, divining rods, amulets, a ceremonial dagger inscribed with astrological symbols of Scorpio and seals of Mars, and parchments marked with occult signs and cryptograms popular in 18th and 19th century English and American folklore. In her 1845 oral memoir, the family matriarch, Lucy Mack Smith, recalled the Smiths' interest in the faculty of abric, a term that might have been lost on some. In fact, abric, or abraxas, is a Gnostic term for God that also served as a magical incantation. Gnostics were members of early Christian sects that had not been enfolded within the church structure. Their literature and theology were a distinctly independent mixture of Christian, classical, and pagan thought. It forms the root of a magic word known to every child, abracadabra. For his part, Joseph Smith venerated the powers of the planet Jupiter, which was prominent in his astrological birth chart. According to Quinn, Smith's first wife, Emma, reported that Smith carried a protective Jupiter amulet up to his death. The surviving silver amulet displays markings that derive from the work of Renaissance mage Cornelius Agrippa, and that were spread among British and American readers by the English occultist Francis Barrett in his 1801 book, The Magus, a popularization and partial copycat of Agrippa. Smith's occult interests closely reflected those that traveled through central New York. Later in life, his theology suggested the existence of a male-female god, an idea found in Hermetic and Gnostic traditions, though one that Smith may have imbibed locally through the teachings of Mother Ann Lee or Jemima Wilkinson. He also grew fascinated with the temple rites and symbols of Freemasonry, a movement of tremendous influence and controversy in the burned-over district, as will soon be seen. The rebellious, spiritually adventuresome Smith began reporting divine visitations in the 1820s, which culminated in the angel called Moroni, directing him to golden plates buried in the hill Cumorah, near his home. It was the same place where local legend held that a lost tribe of Israel had made its last stand, a pillar of Smith's later theology. Like Smith, many early 19th century observers took seriously the existence of a highly developed, pre-Indian civilization in the area. In 1811, New York's Governor DeWitt Clinton told the New York Historical Society, "There is every reason to believe that previous to the occupancy of this country by the progenitors of the present nations of Indians, it was inhabited by a race of men much more populous and much further advanced in civilization. The numerous remains of ancient fortifications which are found in this country demonstrate a population far exceeding that of the Indians when this country was first settled." Clinton and others reported discovering esoteric fraternities among the 19th century Iroquois, which some considered a form of ancient Freemasonry. These speculations were heightened when the Seneca leader Red Jacket and other New York area Indians were seen wearing Freemasonic-style medals in the shape of the square and compass, a fact well documented in a 1903 New York State Museum monograph, Metallic Ornaments of the New York Indians, by archaeologist William M. Beauchamp. All of the area myths, the remnants of a lost civilization, the uses of peepstones, ancient buried treasure, formed tantalizing threads in Joseph Smith's expanding worldview. They wound together in the narrative of the golden plates Smith discovered at Cumorah,
written in reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics and translated by the young seeker through a pair of ancient seer stones.
In 1830, he revealed the testimony as the Book of Mormon. Smith's record traced a vast alternate history, involving a tribe of Israel fleeing the Holy Land for the American continent, experiencing the gospel directly from Christ, and later suffering fracture and vanquish in a great and tremendous battle at Cumorah, until they were all destroyed. Mormon, chapter 8, verse 2. The scale and scope of the Book of Mormon were extraordinary, seen by followers as buttressing the lore of Smith's home district rather than built upon it. Yet Smith's theology found little influence within the burned-over district, where he was often seen as a former peep-stoner, peddling himself as a prophet. Like Israel's lost tribe, Smith and his followers would have to journey west to live out their destiny. But the ideas and loyalties that the prophet developed in central New York converged with profound consequences over the lives of Smith and the small band that followed him down the psychic highway.